Oh gosh, thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be back in London. As Camilla said, I've worked most of my career as an advocate, activist, and joined Bird last year. But my career as an activist in New York City in the States, as we tried desperately to change the way we design our streets, manage our streets, prioritize sustainable mobility, a lot of this actually came from London, right? So show of hands, how many Londoners out there? I presume there's a lot of you. So we had this thing in New York called Lessons from London. Lessons from London, right? Very alliterative. But congestion charging, 20 mile per hour, home zones. When you guys pedestrianized Trafalgar Square, the north side of Trafalgar Square, and right in front of the National Gallery there, that may have been not a huge deal, not as big as the congestion charge, but New Yorkers really took notice. And what Jeanette Sadik-Khan did on Broadway and in Times Square and in Union Square and really all over the city was in many ways inspired by what you guys started doing 10 years ago, reclaiming your streets, controlling the car, giving people a safe option to walk and cycle. And Andy Byford, I don't know if some of you have worked with Andy Byford, he cut his teeth at TfL, of course. And his job right now in New York is to basically save our transit system, which is probably the most important yet thankless task in America right now. So thank you, London, for everything you've given us in the States. It wasn't just London, of course. The revolution that we started in New York 10 or so years ago with, Jeanette Sadik-Khan ascending, Sadik-Khan, not Sadiq-Khan, Jeanette, when she ascended to the commissionership of New York City's Transportation Authority, she brought Nikki Gavrin over from London, and she brought Jan Gehl from Denmark and Enrique Peñalosa from Bogota, and she borrowed all of these amazing best practices from all over the world, and many of you know the story. I had the opportunity to work very closely with Jeanette and her team, and the highlight of my life, the highlight of my career probably will always be when Jeanette and I received the Rockefeller Foundation's Jane Jacobs Award. Any fans of Jane Jacobs out there? Yes, we love Jane. And Robert De Niro also got the award that year for what he did to bring Lower Manhattan back after 9/11. He was a great leader in that regard. And so I still can't believe it happened. And Robert De Niro says to me afterwards, is this still working? He says, "You're the guy who is responsible for all the bike lanes?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I don't like the bike lanes." In that very sort of De Niro way, and put the fear of God into me. And then we chatted for a bit, and it turns out it was actually his driver who really didn't like the bike lanes, not him per se. So we went downstairs, and we talked to his driver, and Robert De Niro is like laughing hysterically, watching me argue with his driver. But I mean, this is how policy happens in New York City, right? It's a very fractious process. It's very political. And when Jeanette started transforming streets, we had the backlash. People who said that if you pedestrianize Times Square, traffic will grind to a halt. Businesses will leave the city. If you build protected bike lanes, you will be feeding people to the lions. People don't want to ride their bikes. Woody Allen came out against bike lanes, right? All these celebrities. So we were in trouble. All of this stuff was going to go away when Mayor Bloomberg, when his third term ended and Jeanette and everyone else was going to leave, you had mayoral candidates saying, if I'm elected mayor, the war on the car will end. And we will return to the way we had it before. Anthony Weiner led the charge. You guys, did news of Anthony Weiner make it over here? Remember him? He didn't win, partly because of what he did personally, but the polling all showed that people supported all of this. They didn't necessarily before, But because Jeanette stuck her neck out and Mayor Bloomberg gave her the rope to do that, we were able to keep it going through Mayor de Blasio. Now, the way we did that is a long story, but it really boils down to the fact that these issues are not just nice to have. These aren't just amenities. They're not some frivolous window dressing. These design and management measures we are bringing to our streets are literally a matter of life and death. And we brought Vision Zero, the policy from Sweden, and we injected it into that debate we were having as our next mayor was being elected. And Mayor de Blasio took Vision Zero up, and it became about saving lives. It wasn't about New York's prominence in the world as an investment and attractor of talent. It was more about saving lives, and it was the politics that we were able to work to keep these policies going and to expand them. And that's really my main message today, is that all of you are innovators, right? We're all working on design, on tech, but ultimately we come against these regulatory obstacles, these political obstacles. There's this adage in politics that losers, even if they're in the minority, they will cry more loudly than winners sing. And it's that small, disaffected minority that can really prevent all of this from happening. So our job is to prove that demand beforehand and get people excited and demonstrate, literally demonstrate that this is what people want. This is, of course, not new to you Europeans. In 1966, in Amsterdam, the provost put the white bikes out on the street, and this was the first attempt at bike sharing. It failed miserably, right? All the bikes ended up in the canal. But they had got it going, and they started it, and they started to prove that demand. In Delft, in 1972, parents upset about their kids being struck by cars put furniture in the street. They teamed up with the Cyclists Union in the Netherlands, and they really started this modern movement we have now for traffic calming and bike lanes. It's really a revelation for Americans to understand that the Danes and the Dutch, it's not genetic, right? They actually fought very hard for these things, and they made conscious policy decisions. In America, critical mass, riding in mass in the street somewhat defiantly, but that turning into Bike to Work Day and being institutionalized in other ways later. When we want a protected bike lane on a street in New York, often we have held hands in the street to provide that safe, protected space for people. And we're holding hands with people who have lost loved ones in traffic, demonstrating the importance of bike lanes, right? These aren't just things that are nice to have. They're a matter of life and death. So this tactical urbanism of trying the pilot project, proving the demand, and then scaling up, right? This is the way all of these innovations have gone. And it takes that initial courage. In September 2017, a gentleman by the name of Travis Vanderzanden in Santa Monica put 10 of these devices on the street and invited people to use them. And at the time, a lot of people said what they used to say about bicycling. This is a toy. This is not real transportation. This is somehow doesn't belong on our streets. But people loved it. People flocked. People wanted a way out. People don't want to lug a 2-ton contraption to buy a gallon of milk. They want free mobility, the freedom of being able to get on one of these and get to where you're going without being encumbered. And it has grown. Now Bird is in more than 100 cities in the United States, several cities here in Europe. And, you guys know how to, show of hands, who's ridden a shared e-scooter? Okay, wow, okay, so a lot of you. These aren't yet available in London. We don't have them yet in New York either. New York and London, late to the party on this one. But there's a majority of city council members in New York who want to see these happen, so we might actually get permission this spring. But, it's really amazing. You just, scan the QR code that's on these bikes. your accelerator's here, your brake, it's fairly intuitive. You have to take a safety tutorial before you hop on one of these things, very important. Wearing your helmet. And then increasingly, as we are working with cities and collaborating, thank you for that word, it's really managing the sidewalk. Because the early returns on e-scooter share are really showing us some fairly remarkable revelations. People care about sidewalk clutter more than anything else, like all the surveys, and for good reason. Pedestrians don't have enough room, right? We used to have these grand sidewalks that were sheared off and sheared off again to make way for the motor car. And so let's make sure we're parking these things properly. And so we endeavor to instruct our users. And I think also it's important that we are using technology to keep these from where they don't belong. And every night, bird chargers take these and they charge them up and they put them back in the morning in nests to make sure that they're out of the public right of way. But my favorite solution to this clutter issue, it's interesting how clutter of scooters is, you see it in the papers and it's such a big thing. It's like, 100 million cars, business as usual, no problem. A little scooter clutter, oh my God, the world's coming to an end. But nevertheless, it's something we have to solve and we're doing it. And when you create that space in the street, the parklet, the stenciled space on the sidewalk, the Mineta Transportation Institute in San Jose, California did a study where all of these tools are being applied, and 98% of scooters were parked properly. So this is a solvable problem. Another big result from these early days of scooter share is that collaboration is more important than surprise. This probably doesn't come as news to all of you, but I think it was necessary, as with those other social movements I mentioned, to really prove the demand. But now I think the scooter industry has grown up very rapidly, and it's about prioritizing cities' needs and how we synergize with goals around climate, equity, access, getting people out of their cars. And so we have this wonderful GovTech platform where cities have a very transparent look into how things are happening in real time with their scooter fleet and data sharing and the rest. The third big takeaway from these early days of scootering is that scooters are replacing car trips. Now, this is what we heard early on, that okay, e-scooters, theoretically, awesome, but you're probably just stealing trips from walking or cycling or transit. Not that taking a transit trip and turning it into a scooter trip is a bad thing, right? I mean, we'd all like more room on the tube, on the subway, but are you replacing car trips? And so the Portland Bureau of Transportation released a big study a couple weeks ago, and it turns out that more than a third of e-scooter trips in Portland, Oregon are trips that would have otherwise been taken by a car, an Uber, a Lyft, a private car. So that's a huge stat that I think is really relevant to the future of this industry. The other thing that the Portland study found is that 6% of scooter users had given up their car, which is amazing. 16% were considering it. In Paris, we've found that 71% of riders are using their cars less, right? So this is proving itself as a legitimate form of travel demand management, getting people out of their cars. People are using e-scooters for transportation, not recreation, not joyriding. A little bit of that is happening, but more than 3/4 of trips in city after city are for real A to B transportation, destinations, work commutes. Demographically, scooter users are looking much more like the general population. More low-income users, more black and brown users. This is obviously a very good thing. In Portland, people who are using e-scooters had never tried the bike share system before. They tried e-scooters, and then they tried the bike share system. So e-scooters are becoming a gateway to the whole panoply of alternative sustainable transportation. Now, safety is the big thing, right? It's what you've heard about in the States. Are shared e-scooters safe? The Portland study, again, looked at the injuries that had occurred over a 4-month period, more than 700,000 e-scooter trips in Portland over a 4-month period, and found that, yes, there were some injuries, but they were not disproportionate. As with bicycling, as with driving, more so with driving, there are improvements we must make to safety. But the bottom line takeaway is that scootering is just as safe as bicycling and absolutely must be made safer with infrastructure improvements. There was a big headline a couple weeks ago from Consumer Reports. 1,500 nationwide scooter injuries in the United States. And you can imagine a lot of the sensational sort of hyperbolic coverage. There have been tens of millions of shared e-scooter trips in the US in the past year. There are more shared e-scooter trips now than bike share trips, both docked and dockless. So in its first year of operation, again, proving that demand. So with tens of millions of trips, yes, you will see some injuries. But the injuries are not disproportionate. Per mile, we're seeing as safe or safer than bicycling. And so that's very important, I think, for all of us to point out as we work to make it safer. You know, the overnight riding is an issue. The few deaths that we've had in the US and in Europe, they're happening at like 3 a.m. So when we started, you know, Travis came from Uber, and he knows about, you know, the dangers of drunk driving. So we made a very early policy decision to make sure we were not operating overnight in those early morning hours. And I think that's one of the many regulatory best practices that you're going to be hearing more about moving forward. But the last real takeaway that I've mentioned a bit already is this enormous demand. 5% of Parisians have used a shared e-scooter. 10% of residents in Tel Aviv have used a shared e-scooter. So the demand is there. So with all this demand, there's this virtuous cycle, right? More ridership, more political power, better infrastructure leading to more ridership. So it's this beautiful virtuous circle, a cycle. And I think scooters can like hypercharge this, right? There's more people riding, and to the extent we are replacing cars, which looks to be a very large extent, we will reap a spatial dividend. So replacing car trips with scooter trips, making it much easier to carve more space out on our streets for shared mobility. And that's a beautiful thing, and that's where it's going. But we have to do better than that. We're facing major global crises. And this is a solution staring us in the face. But again, the politics, the regulation, we have to surmount some of these challenges. And I want to bring it back to Sir Joseph Bazalgette, because he proved that when the science was on your side, Dr. John Snow, right, the father of epidemiology, you used to get cholera because you were unlucky. It was just a fact of living in a big city. It was like, you know, if you get hit by a car, you know, it's unfortunate, but it just happens. It turns out cholera was totally preventable. The data was there. The science was there. This was not really a political decision. There were politics involved, but there was an urgency. There was a moral imperative to disrupt London's neighborhoods, invest enormous amounts of money in this massive safety engineering project. And I think really that's kind of where we are today with the future of urban streets. The data is getting so clear. On Queens Boulevard in New York City, that used to be the boulevard of death. Now it's the boulevard of life. That's what people actually call it, because not a single person has died there since the redesign, since the protected bike lanes, the pedestrian safety improvements, lowering the speed limit. It still works as a thoroughfare for motor vehicles, but people can cross it. People can ride and walk. And the data is so very strong that this is no longer something that's subject to negotiation or debate. This is pure safety engineering. And with climate change looming so very, very large, this is the kind of urgency that we need to bring to our work. It's a health imperative, it's a safety imperative, and we have the solutions staring us in the face. So this is my final lesson from London. It's really understanding that we are all, I think, engineers who are, building the world that we want to see, and politics will always play a role, right? And we'll do our best to answer the critics. But I think with the data getting so strong that this is a viable alternative, that our streets can absolutely be made safer, we're moving to a place where Sir Joseph Bazalgette brought us a few centuries ago. Thank you very much.